The title of this video probably has some folks scratching their heads. Of course, martial arts like karate, judo, and even aikido are to a point successful in the United States, but that's not really what I'm talking about. I'm speaking more so of the cultural, historical, and social components of Budo, which I think has been done a big disservice in popular discussion. For the sake of clarity, I want to first say that this video is not a critique of what a certain slice of the internet calls cultural appropriation. Interactions between cultures inherently create changes, both deliberate and unconscious, when one is transferred into another. This is the historical standard and is normal and expected. This video is not about the Americanization of Japanese martial arts, which is only a matter of course in my opinion. Instead, what this video is mostly a commentary on are those individuals that would use traditions, culture, and history to say things authoritatively while clearly not understanding the sources they are drawing upon. An example I've brought up on this channel before is that concept of martial means warlike, it comes from the god Mars, therefore martial arts are about fighting. It goes something like that. At face value, this sounds reasonable, and I assume that's why it's sort of caught on, but applied to Japanese martial arts, it's kind of stupid. For one thing, using the Western etymology of the word martial in the context of martial arts while referring to, say, karate is a bit of a bizarre move, given the term martial arts was introduced to English vernacular in the post-World War II years as a direct translation of Budo. It makes infinitely more sense to track down the meanings of the character Bu than to trace it back to a Roman god. Doing this is sort of like saying, there is this tree that specifically and only grows in Japan that I really want to study, so I've decided to go to southern Italy to learn about it. It just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Without a doubt, the character Bu can mean, and typically does mean, martial or military. But it can also mean something like bravery, which refers to a certain character archetype. So while you could read Budo as martial way, it could also be read as courageous way. These aren't necessarily the same thing either. One clearly emphasizes fighting of some kind, while the other suggests the practice is about managing fear in, quite possibly, all arenas of life. All this being said, I think these sorts of word games are just splitting hairs. I don't like them that much. If this is all I had to come with you with, I would not be writing this video. The real problem I have is that the cultural portion of Budo usually just gets ignored and stripped down of all context in English spoken language. What folks really need to understand, especially the Budo is for fighting crowd, is that there is pretty good evidence that martialness has always been of tertiary interest in Budo. The reality is that the Budo are just one example of do or way. The point of pursuing a way is that, at least metaphysically speaking, to acquire a sort of enlightenment. More secularly, however, the pursuit of a way was meant to civilize a person. But let's stick a pin in that. I'll come back to it in a bit. What is important here, however, is that it didn't matter which way you chose to pursue. This could have been flower arrangement, poetry, dance, calligraphy, or indeed martial arts. But I can't stress enough that these were all seen as being in the same category. The flavor of your chosen way was always secondary to the pursuit, which was seen as bestowing core benefits to the practitioner. The analogy I've always heard is that everyone is climbing the same mountain, going towards the same summit, but every path is different. In this sense, it is actually pretty explicit that the Bu in Budo plays second fiddle to the Do, the way. There is another issue here, though. When you say bushi, meaning warrior, you really have to be clear about to when you're referring to. Because yes, at one point that would have broadly meant exactly what it says on the tin, warriors. But by the mid to late Tokugawa era, that term had deep class implications. You weren't really referring to warriors so much as you were referring to the noble class, the gentry. Now, not all samurai were wealthy, especially towards the end of the shogunate, but many were. This was an era where being a quote-unquote warrior tended to mean you had intellectual pursuits, might be some kind of bureaucrat in the government, and generally existed at the higher tiers of society. Fighting wasn't really on these guys' minds. They weren't the type of person who were out in the streets getting into brawls, and they probably had bodyguards, to be perfectly honest with you. They had people for that. Also, by no accident, is this when the Bujutsu schools really came into their maturity. I've mentioned this before on the channel, but evidence for martial arts in the way we think of them today being used on the battlefield is really, really poor. One of the more damning revelations in the scholarship is that we know, for a fact, there were not enough schools to produce trained practitioners on the scale of armies or even larger units more generally. In fact, even if you said the academics had counted incredibly incorrectly, or perhaps we found some new cache of documents, and we discovered that there were actually 5 times more schools operating than what we currently think there were, the students being produced from those schools would still be lucky to account for even 1% of total military personnel. The reality is that if these schools were really that applicable to warfare, daimyo at the tail end of the Warring States period would have been investing to have at least a crack team of elite soldiers trained, and we just don't see those sorts of investments happening. What we do see, though, is a lot of very wealthy people hiring Bujutsu people as private teachers and retainers, so think bodyguards. So there was a fighting application to this, but really the stability, the salary, came from being a private tutor. This would largely continue even into peacetime, and it is this cultural heritage that I think makes Budo almost oil to the United States' cultural water. In America, my home country, martial arts are largely seen as a folk activity, even if we wouldn't really use that word today necessarily. But boxing, just as an example, has a bit of a stereotype for attracting young men from poor areas with an aggression in them, often vaguely aimed at a system they feel has failed them, and sometimes it has. Even something like BJJ, which has a reputation for bringing in tech bros and nerds who typically earn fairly high salaries, it's still essentially an outgrowth of Brazilian and then, by extension, West Coast surfer culture. Indeed, its narrative in popular culture is also one that smells deeply of anti-establishment sentiments, a skepticism of the mainstream. It positions itself, even in all of its modern popularity, as a subculture. Imported arts, too, tend to get reinterpreted. In the case of Aikido, for example, it has taken on a New Age tint in the States, held up as an alternative, perhaps, to mainstream Christian spiritualism. My first point here is that in America, martial arts are American football, they're rugby. In Japan, at least historically, they are polo, or synchronized swimming. These are elite pastimes. And by elite, I don't mean better than everyone else. I generally mean wealthier than everyone else. People who have a lot more leisure time. I think Americans could get over the class origins, frankly, though, if the goals of Budo weren't so different. The fact of the matter here is that the aims of Budo were what I mentioned earlier, to civilize a practitioner. In this case, what I mean is they exist in part to integrate a person into mainstream society. They are not countercultural at all. I've heard many Many times, Americans complain about lining up, having to wear the same uniform as everyone else, bowing to dead guys on walls, bowing to each other, using titles for your teachers, and all the other etiquette that comes with training a Budo. They basically throw up their hands and complain about how all this stuff is anachronistic and has nothing to do with fighting, which in a way is sort of correct. It's not about fighting. It's about training the social rules of Japan. And I have to admit, while some of it is actually a little dated today, even in Japan proper, it has at least been incredibly successful for me because I feel pretty at home playing the Japanese social game. I'm not going to pretend I'm as good as someone who grew up here natively, but at least compared to some of my peers who also live here from abroad, even when their Japanese is much better than mine, I often can compete just by knowing Japanese social culture better than them. I would definitely say my comfort in doing so, though, has been cultivated from mostly my martial arts training. I believe Americans tend to craft a very cherry-picked fantasy around samurai. They glorify Musashi, for example, famous duelist with no master, traveling the countryside, spitting on conventions of his time, and going wherever he pleases, an avatar of freedom. The issue is that they rarely focus on his later life, in which he tried very hard to get employed by a lord, and while you have to read a little bit in between the lines, he appears to have been basically unemployable, even though he was a prolific martial artist, perhaps objectively the best swordsman in Japan at the time. He spent much of his latter days trying to ingratiate his progeny with the upper class, which is, of course, all to say that even the free-spirited Musashi eventually tried to integrate into the mainstream system. Today, if someone says the word ronin, they typically are referring to someone without a job. It doesn't usually have a positive connotation. On top of this, the original folk art of Japan was really sumo. Hard to believe given the polish that scene has today. So what happened to the amateur scene? What happened to provincial tournaments and street-side bouts? Well, the government banned them because it was seen as causing too much trouble and unrest. Sumo was only allowed to return when it was institutionalized. The techniques were given names, all sanctioned bouts would happen on shrine grounds, and there would be a governing organ overseeing the whole affair. It was only when the folk art conformed to the system that it was allowed to exist and subsequently thrive. Meanwhile, the main income for martial arts was mostly through those aforementioned wealthy patrons. Yes, toward the end of the shogunate, martial arts became a bit more popular and liberalized, and they took normal people as students, but the real money, status, and certainly stability lie with private sponsors. You can even see this as late as the 1930s, as Aikido really followed this model pretty heavily in its early days. But keep in mind, even Judo originally was an art devised by an academic, someone from the upper class, looking to retool traditional martial heritage into a physical education. And I do not think he meant physical education as in PE class. He meant ethics, social skills, among other things, through the medium of judo. Fundamentally, I think this is why Budo will probably never truly catch on in the States. Arguably, the pillar of American culture is a profound skepticism of authority. Just look at the country's origin story. I generally think that it's actually a healthy thing, but the American solution to this problem, historically, domestically, and even in foreign policy, is usually to just rip up the existing system and call it progress. Modern American martial arts culture isn't really so different. Personally, I think the popular consensus on traditional martial arts in the States is a lot like Cold War foreign policy. Yeah, we don't really understand the culture, language, or history of this state, but don't worry, we can fix it with bombs, with a sprinkle of CIA, black ops, and regime change. At the very least, that's sort of how I read it when some MMA bro says they can beat up a traditional martial artist. Like, congratulations, I guess. But the premise you're running with is wildly misinformed. This art that you're trying to fight has expressly different goals than your practice does. It doesn't need to be fixed or exposed, and certainly not using violence as a vehicle sourced from some outside, completely unrelated person. Sure, it might need to be explained better, advertised more clearly. I would totally grant that, but it's very much an apples and oranges thing. Certainly, in my early years in Japan, I regularly espoused that I trained martial arts to learn to fight or defend myself to my peers. And what I found is that no matter the style of dojo, karate, judo, aikido, or whatever else, the most common response to my assertion was a look of confusion and sometimes a politely worded, "Why would you train for that?" My feeling is that martial arts in the States are taken to be a bottom-up pastime. It revels in being just separate enough from the mainstream to still be something of an alternative to more popular time investments or professional careers. Whereas in Japan, the idea is very much so to integrate practitioners into a shared mainstream cultural practice. American martial arts always want to fight and are skeptical of the status quo. Japanese martial arts really think of fighting as a marginal aim and spend a lot more time presenting mainstream cultural values through the medium of martial practice. To wrap this up, I want to stress that I am not demeaning the American approach here. In fact, I think it would be great if more Japanese people trained like the Americans and more Americans trained like the Japanese people. Neither of these approaches is without flaw. The Americans think they have a hammer, so everything is a nail, but the Japanese tend to believe replication is an end unto itself, when in fact, that way, or do, that is held in so much exaltation has always advocated for personal evolution. Of course, even here, people don't really know the tradition all that well. I could have a whole video explaining about why history actually is important because it's reflected in our training assumptions, but I think I'll leave it at this. When push comes to shove, I think all the educational content in the world won't change the landscape of this topic. It seems to me many so-called modern martial artists are addicted to taking the piss out of traditional styles, and traditional styles tend to be addicted to the mythology of their history. That is to say, the reason people do not focus on Musashi after his dueling win streak is because it kind of ends with him looking not nearly as successful as the first part of his story might suggest. He finishes off as an old man dejected in a cave, completely unemployed, scribbling down what he's learned about life and his commentary more broadly on the nature of things, which can make for good writing, but in context, it definitely kind of changes how you read those things. I've had many peers in Japanese history academia who wanted to do papers or research on samurai, only to be absolutely deflated upon realizing how much of doing that topic justice has to do with things like tax code. People want to say Bu means martial and martial means warlike because it sort of appeals to the LARP. Never mind that many of these arts were devised by nobles for noble consumption with the aim of teaching them how to not fumble high-class polite society. None of this is to say there weren't exceptions, of course, nor does it mean the fighting applications in Japanese Budo have nothing to offer the martially minded. They do. But my point is that if you're going to draw on traditions to assert your position or your beliefs, you'd better understand those traditions well. At the end of his life, Musashi wrote something to the effect that flowery swordsmanship was on the rise, and that even in the short time since the unstable warring states period ended, martial ability was in severe decline. That used to resonate a lot with me, and I think it probably resonates with a lot of people looking at traditional martial arts systems. They feel very performative, largely because they are. But now, I think Musashi might have written those words in resentment towards a system that rejected him. From his point of view, and perhaps even objectively, he was the best swordsman in all of Japan. Yet his wealth and social standing really wasn't anything to write home about. It was not proportional to his dueling record. Perhaps he was bitter because he essentially got that highly competitive degree, proved himself in the field, but kept losing job opportunities to people he sees as inferior just because those competing applicants were able to make the boss laugh during their interviews. To me, I really think this is at the heart of American martial arts values. The perception of simplicity and authenticity. You knock a guy out or submit him, your star rises. It's not about office politics or networking or knowing how to put together a resume. Even if it actually is a bit about that, I would argue that modern UFC is very performative, but I'm not going to try and break people's immersion in this video. It's a pure measurement of skill over and over again, or at least that's what people believe. And look, I sympathize with that, I really do. But Budo generally aims to be an allegory for all that in-between stuff that we tend to look down on. Office politics, networking, how to build a resume, making the boss laugh in interviews. If you want a deeper elaboration on that, you can check out my video on Aikido as Japanese social culture. But for now, that is all I have. Thank you so much for watching and listening. There is no channel without you, and I will catch you all in the next one. Peace.